Hello and welcome to another episode of 177 Nations of Tasmania. The Irish are, without a doubt, one of the great migratory peoples of modern history, populating the Americas and Australasia in the millions for more than 100 years, to such an extent that the population of Ireland today is less than it was over 150 years ago. Today, Ireland is one of the wealthiest nations in Europe, and migration to this part of the world has very much slowed down. My guest for this episode, John, grew up in the 1940s and 50s in Limerick, in the west of Ireland, in an era when Ireland was still something of a backwater, and many young Irish took the first opportunity to head to the UK and beyond. John also had a taste of travel at a young age, with trips to France and elsewhere in Europe. And in his 20s, he moved to London to work as an accountant in the travel industry. And this would be the first step of many wanderings and several different careers, which would take him to Montreal, Bermuda, Uganda, Sydney, and finally, Hobart. With such a long life and so many travels, John really has some tale to tell.
I was born in Limerick, the third city of Ireland, and I grew up there until my middle 20s.
And when you were growing up, what kind of place was Limerick?
It's a town about the size of Launceston, but population at the time was about 50,000 people, considering that Tasmania is roughly 10% smaller than the Republic of Ireland. And Ireland at the time when I was growing up had about 4 million people compared to Tasmania's 500,000. So I feel quite comfortable here because there's an awful lot more space. We thought it was a big city, but it was a small regional city, again, like Launceston for anybody who's been there. And it was a very conservative, partly industrial city, but very close to the countryside. So Ireland, this we're talking about back in the 40s and 50s. I was born in 41. So it was close to being an agricultural community, but it wasn't an agricultural community because it was a city. So my father was a solicitor. My mother had been to university, which is unusual for women back in the 30s. But she did occasional French teaching afterwards. She had done a degree in French and English.
And what was the neighbourhood where you grew up in? What were your what are your strongest memories of that?
It was on the main road going from Limerick to the west of Ireland. It was a 10-minute walk into town. And if we didn't walk it, we used bicycles all the time to get in and out. So I used a bike to get into school. And sometimes it was early because one was an altar boy. So being an altar boy, you had to get in for the 8 o'clock mass sometimes, which didn't suit me because I wasn't an early riser. Still haven't.
Was the church and church life still a big part of life in Ireland?
Church was absolutely a big part of life. Yeah. I went to a Catholic school, went to a Jesuit school, but before that, my first school was 3 minutes walk from the house, run by Salesian nuns. And I have good memories of that. It was peaceful. And then I went to Crescent College, which was 15 minutes walk, because I was at the top of town, and 10-minute bicycle ride.
What would you say would be some of your best memories from your school days? What stands out?
Probably going to the seaside, which was 40 miles away. My father used to play golf every Sunday, and there were 3 boys in my family. I was the middle boy, and the Hinch was about 40 miles away, which is about an hour's drive back in the early days, perhaps a bit longer than an hour. And my father would play golf, and we would go down to the beach, walk along the beach, occasionally even go for a swim. That's my best memory of growing up in Limerick. It's not being in Limerick, it's being in the Hinch.
What was the beach like in Ireland? I imagine, and I have been to that sort of around that area of Ireland, but it's quite different from what we would visualise as a beach in Australia.
In this case, probably not.
Okay.
The Hinch is one of the top surf beaches in Europe. The wind comes right in from the west and gets big swells and so on. And it's a big beach, probably is about at least a kilometre long. there were two places, Lahinch and Kilkee. Kilkee was 60 miles from Limerick, but that was more of a bigger fishing village, and we used to go down there every year. The family would rent a cottage from one of the fisher folk. No idea where they went. They went to parents or grandparents or something for the month of June, and half of Limerick would seem to be there. That was one of the memories I had, because if you go to the seaside is always a good place to have fun when you're 7, 8, 10 years old.
And so when you progressed to high school, how was high school different, apart from being a bit further away?
It was a boys-only school, and the teachers were either priests or people who were becoming priests, with a small smattering of lay teachers. But that was the 50s, so it was a different world. Nowadays, my brother was a principal of one of the Jesuit schools in Ireland for a while, and when I go and visit him, that school is next door to where he is now, and he talks about how there isn't any Jesuit priest in the school, in some of the schools now, because the schools are run by committees, by parent and organizations, and so the whole world has changed completely in that regard. For me, having priests around and talking with them was standard practice, but I'd say nowadays would not be the same, anything like it.
Yeah, I gather that's pretty similar in other traditionally Catholic countries as well.
Yes.
And so education's become a bit more secular?
Yes, a lot more secular. The country itself has become a lot more secular.
Was there any particular teacher or priest that was particularly influential or that you took particular notice of?
Probably two. I just had a flash. In the school, you felt free enough to talk to the priest at any time. I remember in my last year in school, going into the assembly hall, the concert hall, which is part of the school, and my Greek teacher, I did a bit of classical Greek for my sins, and he was playing the piano. He was a very good pianist, and he was playing some Beethoven sonata or something on the piano on there. And when he had finished, I said to him, "Father, did you go to the concert last night?" And he said, "No," he said, "they were playing that barbarian Tchaikovsky." So that memory is good, because it showed that we were able to be friendly with priests, but also that some of them were extremely conservative. I was talking about a concert that the Radio Éireann Symphony Orchestra, the equivalent of our TSO, had come from Dublin down to play, and played in one of the big cinemas. And I'd gone to the concert with my mother. I thought it was terrific. But Tchaikovsky, Fifth Symphony was not. It was a barbarian as far as, because an awful lot of people in the classical world think that any music written before 1840 or after 1840 is just not music. And the other guy, there was one of the lay teachers we had in our last year in school, was a fellow called Owen Moore, and Owen was a very good actor. He used to play and stuff, and he made the English class. We did Hamlet, I remember, our last year. As a result, I can still recall whole chunks of Hamlet and recite them if you really want to hear, but I won't. But he was very influential on me, and the importance of the English language and the words that we use.
During perhaps your latter high school years, did you develop any sort of plan or idea of what you wanted to do with your life in the future?
No. In fact, it was at the time, back in the 50s, in many ways people didn't have much of a clue how do you get boys or girls into a channel that suits them. And I was unfortunate or fortunate in a way. I was jumped, about 10 of us out of our class was jumped from third year into fifth year. We skipped fourth year. We were told because we were so smart we were going to. And looking back, and I think, well, perhaps it was that they had too many students in one class and not enough in the other. So, who knows? But we took it for granted that what they were telling us was true. We were clever, so we went into with boys who were a year older than us. And as a result, I was just 17 when I left school, and I was probably a fairly young 17. So I didn't have a clue what was out there because I was from a professional family. My father had his own small business as a solicitor. My family probably thought, well, there's no university in Limerick at the time. So if I wanted to go to university, I'd had to go to Dublin. And I don't think we could afford to go. They couldn't afford to put me there. My brother was at the time going through university to become a solicitor, to take over my father's business or to go into it. So the only profession seemed to be open was accountancy. So I went into that. I could have done something connected to photography. I had my own darkroom in my house, and I was a reasonably competent photographer. And but how would I become that? There didn't seem to be any avenue to become a photographer. There was a local paper, and I perhaps could have done that, but that was very much a kind of a working class job as a photographer at that time. And I could have become perhaps a journalist because my English standard was pretty high. So I could do that, but hey, profession is there, it's open, go into it, easy. So I did.
So where did you do your training for that?
The training was almost non-existent.
Oh, right.
You sign up for a 5-year apprenticeship, basically, to a chartered accountant. And if the chartered accountant felt like he'd teach you some stuff, but you just learned on the job otherwise.
Okay.
I think I might have had 5 or less classes of any kind in the 5 years I was there. It was the sort of stuff that's good for people who are lighthouse keepers. Do it from books. But being qualified in that, I initially was able to go to Canada. No, first to London for a few years. As I used to tell people who asked, I went there to learn the language, but then went to Canada, then came to Australia.
So at what stage did you go to the UK?
In my early 20s, after doing my articles, as they call them, with a chartered accountant, I worked for 6 months as an accountant at an industrial business in Shannon Airport, which is about 15 miles away. And after 6 or 9 months there, I thought, I really need to do something else. So I thought, go and see if I can get a job in London. So I did, got one.
And what was the impetus for that? Was it just that London was some place that you knew about?
I was always a traveller. At the age of 19, I hitchhiked through France into Italy. At the age of 20, I went on a rail trip around France. 21, I did somewhat similar. So by the time I was finished my articles after 5 years, I'd been all around a number of countries in Europe, but I hadn't been to England.
Oh, right.
I used to fly to France because it was a cheap flight from Dublin to Cherbourg, and I decided, well, I really would like to go somewhere else. So I could go to Dublin, but I thought, it's just as easy to go to London. So I went to London. I was in London in the 60s when London was swinging London. I learned all about it after I left.
Okay.
I went over to London initially because I wanted to test out the travel industry. As I told you, I began foreign travel early, hitchhiking around France and Italy when I was 19 in 3 weeks. I remember coming back, I ended up at home with 2 and 6pence in my pocket. So, and I worked out back then that if you want to travel, all you need is a passport and a sentence that begins, why not? So I wanted to get into the travel business itself because I thought, if I get into the travel business, I'd do an awful lot more travel. Unfortunately, business and travel for fun are not quite the same thing. So I got a job in London very quickly, and I went over to London, stayed there for a few years, but I switched from one travel agency, which was a small one, into a bigger one, doing accountancy work. And it seemed like, it's a start. But after a while, I figured, well, I don't think this is actually going to work. The theory of connecting travel agencies with actual enjoyment of travel didn't quite work for me. So I went out looking for what else to get into. And I got into technology, basically. Early days of computers, so systems analyst with ICT, which is International Computers and Tabulators, the English equivalent of IBM.
And is that when you moved to Birmingham?
That's when I moved to Birmingham for a year. Worked with another company, National Cash Register, on the accounting machine side, and then moved back to London and worked with ICT.
And at what point did you go to Canada?
That was about the fourth year of being in England. England was going through some difficult times, apart from the fact that I was in London, as I may have told you before, but I was in London during what was known as the swinging 60s. As Mr. Cool Guy, I found out all about the swinging 60s after I left, which I think was one of the great sadnesses of my life. I don't have many regrets, but that's one of them, I think. But I learned enough about computers in their early stages to be a systems analyst. But in England, the pound had devalued, and there was a sense of things are not going well in England in the late 60s. So I thought, where else do I go to? I could have gone to America, because lots of Irish go to America. But at the time, you were in danger of being drafted to go to Vietnam if you went to America as a migrant. So I decided, well, what about Canada? I spoke a bit of French, so I thought Montreal was a much more interesting city, being French and English, than Toronto, which is only English. So I decided, well, let's go and have a look at Canada. So I immigrated, became a landed immigrant in Canada in 1968.
Yeah, and what was Montreal like at the time? I gather it was a bit of a happening city.
It was a very happening city. The year before, Expo 67, which was a big industrial commercial exhibition, held every 4 years, I guess, in different around the world, had been a big hit for Montreal at the time. Took years to pay it off, as they found out later with the Olympics, the same sort of thing. These things take a long time to pay off sometimes. But it was a good time to be in Canada. It was a growing economy, positive. Weather was not so great. There's a lot of snow between November and March. But it's quite sunny in the winter as well. So it was an interesting place to be. And I got a job within a couple of days with Rolls-Royce. They made air engines over there. And I was a systems analyst for a year or so. Then I decided, I think I'd do better if I switched into my profession, into accountancy. So I got a job with an industrial company downtown. I like the idea of being downtown whenever I'm in a city. And it went okay until 3 years later I decided to go to Bermuda.
And how did that come about?
I was getting a bit fed up with the weather of Montreal. The winters are hard, but it's a good city to be in. I knew people who didn't own overcoats because they never went out into the open air during the winter. Right. Because the underground system was so effective, the underground railways, metro. You had access to 42 restaurants or 27 cinemas, all that sort of stuff, without going above ground. So there's a lot of good things happening in Montreal. But by the time the winter got to me, I had a problem with the weather. And I thought, I should really become an internal auditor with somebody like American Express, because I can go back into the idea of being in the travel business, go around to places around the world and be an auditor, very highly paid, relatively speaking, staying in expensive hotels, comfortable. Not bad for a couple of years. I was offered the job, didn't take it, and somebody else offered me another job to go to Bermuda and live there and work for an insurance company. And I'd never been to Bermuda. And I read up about it and learned about it and thought, this looks like it might not be a bad place to live. Semi-tropical, not tropical, north of the Caribbean, about 600 miles north of the Caribbean. nearest big city, New York. So I gave it a go. Stayed there 3 years and re-immigrated to Montreal. I'm a serial migrant, I think.
Yes. And what was Bermuda like?
Bermuda was very attractive. It's a nice, small island, colonial, so it had its problems. Total population around 60 or 70,000, of which probably 60% were black, 65% black. There was no, as far as I could see, there was no racial problem. There was the usual colonial problem, because remember, this was simply the very early 70s. And the whites basically ran the place. And like, for example, the golf club I was a member of, as a perk of my job, I got a membership of a golf course. There were no blacks in the club. And I found that very strange after Montreal, which is a much more cosmopolitan place. Mm-hmm. But the golf was good, the tennis was good, the sailing was very good, the swimming was very good, there were some lovely beaches, and everything was easy to get around. But then after 6 months, for some reason or other, Uganda blew up. Idi Amin, actually just before Idi Amin took over, the president of Uganda wanted to change the subsidiary company of the company I was working for in Bermuda into a half government-owned organization. Mm-hmm. So they said, well, we'd like to discuss this. And my boss was going to go and be the accountant in a small team to set up the company in Uganda. And he was declared persona non grata. He wasn't allowed to go because he was South African. And at the time, South Africa was very apartheid. And so being a South African, he wasn't welcome in black Africa. So my boss's boss said, yeah, do you want to go? I said, where? Why? Why not? So I went to Uganda for 5 months and stayed in Kampala, very interesting. Now that was tropical, but very interestingly tropical because it's spring-like in some ways. Mm-hmm. Because it's a bit like Mexico City. It's about 5,000 or 6,000 feet above sea level. It was very interesting working with East Indians, as they call themselves, blacks, whites. It was a very interesting place to be for a young man who liked travel. Until after about 5 months, Idi Amin decided to take over from the president. The president was in Singapore at a conference. So Idi Amin formed a coup. And I was woken up in the middle of the night in the hotel I was staying in by the sound of tanks in the streets. Looked over didn't know what was going on. I found out quite quickly what was going on. We were told, the foreigners were told, it's nothing to do with you, no problem, go away, nothing happening here, sort of thing. And it was true, they actually had, even though Idi Amin's story later becomes a bit more ugly, at the time he had pretty good, he was the head of the army, and he had pretty good control of the people. So my boss decided that he would ship his wife and children out, and I went with them 2 days later. When it first happened, I just heard the sound of a tank at 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning. And I thought, what's going on? What sort of machinery is going around here at this time of the morning? Right downtown Kampala. And then I heard some shooting into distance. There was always a certain amount of background. There could have been occasionally background shooting, like once every couple of weeks or something, when somebody was having an argument or a gang raiding a liquor store or something out in an outside suburb. But this was serious shooting. And it turned out they were taking over the radio station. And the following morning, when half of the people who were working in the hotel had disappeared into the bush because they didn't know what was happening, and they might have been the wrong tribe, because these things were usually tribal. So halfway during that morning, the chief of police's house was blown up directly behind the hotel, which was a little bit of a shake-up, a reminder that this was serious. And that's when the news started to filter through that this is a real coup and probably not a good idea to hang around too long. We drove the driver of the chauffeur of my boss's car. He was the only one who had a car, but it was safer to have somebody local drive you around. And that guy drove my boss's wife and 2 children and me to Nairobi, which was hundreds of miles away. But we went through about 3 or 4 checkpoints. I must say, having a 16-year-old with a rifle, sticking his rifle in the window of the car, was an experience I wouldn't look forward to again.
Mm.
When I decided to go back to Montreal, I was going to change the world completely, my world. I was going to do something different. I wasn't going to stick as an accountant. And the first thing to do, I thought, was, I have never read all of Shakespeare, so why don't I go and do that at a university? So I decided to do an English degree. So I sort of semi-retired at about age 32 or something, and did an English degree, an honours English degree in 2 years, by doing overload of courses in the summer. And I did part-time jobs. Like, I worked in a bar for a short while. I did a bit of teaching. I taught accountancy in McGill University for a few semesters at basic level. I could teach the basic stuff. I wouldn't have done any of the serious stuff. But I got by quite well in Montreal, going back into a different world. And then after 2 years, I decided to set up my own business as a headhunter, based on the business of my business experience of being an accountant and what accountants do and how people hire accountants, how they should hire accountants. And I ran that business for 5 years as a headhunter in Montreal, quite successfly.
And then at what point did you decide to go to Australia, and why?
It's all got to do with travel and weather, I think. I seem to adapt better to weather under different circumstances. Montreal hadn't changed its weather pattern. Mm-hmm. Winters were still tough. So the temptation to go to a better climate was always there, but I was enjoying Montreal. I was doing reasonably well. But a pal of mine had come back from living in Australia, and he had in fact worked in the record industry, and he was full of stories about being in Sydney when the Beatles went there. Because, of course, being in the record industry, his company actually did the Beatles. So he was full of stories about being with the Beatles in Sydney and how Sydney was a great town and all the rest of it. So I thought, maybe I should go and have a look. So I decided, and Montreal was getting a bit dodgy because there was a struggle between the English Canadians and the French Canadians. Mm-hmm. French Canada was becoming a bit in Quebec. Montreal is the capital of Quebec, a major city anyway. And there were the occasional violence in the background. And I thought, this is not very comfortable. So I thought, well, maybe it's time to move to Toronto for a while. So, as I told people for a while, I'm actually going to Toronto by way of Sydney. And I just never completed the journey. I decided to change my career completely, to try and meld in some way my two backgrounds of accountancy, business, and the English degree, my playing, my enjoyment of words. I've been a big reader since 4 years of age. So I thought, well, I should be able to do something based on documents that business produces, like annual reports, like marketing documents, like letters to government or like letters by government people. So I knocked on a few doors and said, can I write your annual report? And this basic response I got from a lot of people was, well, not really. Can you do anything else? So I explored what else I could do, what they needed. And I found within a short while that I was able to do other things. And I did get an annual report through somebody who I met back then and knew him when he moved to Hobart many years later, Leo Schofield. He had just sold out from his advertising agency in Sydney, and he set up a public relations company. And I saw in some trade magazine that he had done this. So I sent him a letter, and the letter basically said, I'm in the translation business, translating the language of business people into the ordinary language of people who need to know something. So I had worked on the letter that I sent him, and I got a letter back saying, I only reply to amusing letters, come and see me. So I did, and I got my first job for writing an annual report, and it was with an investment bank. And so I had never written an annual report at this stage, but I wrote it, interviewed all the top people in a week, wrote it over the weekend, and presented it on Monday. And they said, this is extraordinarily fast. I didn't realize you couldn't do it, but I did it. And so, because people knew how difficult it was to get all the people together and to extract the story. But it was an eye-opener for me too, because it showed what could be done. And so I was able to sell that on, that concept. Well, I can do the annual report quickly and reasonably effectively. I was always interested in clear language. I had done, in my English degree, I'd looked at things like plain English, but I was more interested in workable English rather than anything, the plain part. The plain is automatic to me. And in my letter, I think I'd used the word, I was in the explaining business, which is what I think, I didn't like the word public relations, but the explanation business, the explaining business, is where you help people to put their best foot forward, to say what's most important from their point of view, to let people know. So public relations has a bad image in some ways, but if it's done properly, it's simply explaining. Yeah. So giving people a chance to be themselves and to express what they need to do in a way that makes it understandable to the people they want to influence. As a result of that kind of work, I segued into, over the years, a little bit of teaching, a little bit of training, and I ended up coaching people one-on-one on how to be more effective in their writing, whatever they were doing. I've done it for banks in Sydney, and then when I came down here, I did it with government bodies, with industrial bodies, with whatever. When people had to write as part of their job, I could help them to do it better.
And so what brought you to Tasmania?
I was living in Sydney, had lived in Sydney for 20 years, and Sydney was getting too hot. I knew that there was climate change. It was perfectly obvious to me. When I first went there were about a half dozen days in the year which were uncomfortably hot, really seriously uncomfortably hot. By the time I left, there were 30 instead of the 6. So, to me, that's climate change. I don't care what the details are. That's the big picture. And my doctor had said, yeah, with your chest, you'd be better off somewhere else. Too polluted. It was too young, too noisy. And I thought, I want somewhere different, a bit quieter. And I decided that I'd been to Hobart a number of times. I'd been on a few different holidays to Tasmania. So I was quite comfortable down here. It also had similarities to Ireland. So I felt comfortable from that point of view as well. So I thought, give it a go. So it was between Newcastle and Hobart. And
you made the right choice.
I made the right choice, absolutely. Newcastle, I was talking to somebody from Newcastle, said, yeah, it's got hotter. And also, I really wanted to go somewhere that had a good classical musical environment.
Okay.
So I told people, I wrote an article, in fact, for 40 Degrees South, shortly after I arrived, which started off something about, I like to see the expression of my friends' faces in Sydney when I give them the answer to their question, what took you to Hobart of all places? And I answer, the nightlife.
Not many people would have said that.
And I proved it because my interest was in classical music, and classical music here is phenomenal for the size of the place, and it's accessible. Back in those days, you could park outside where the concert was going on. Now you have to park all of two blocks away. But there was a very good conservatorium of music, which had a lot of activity and a lot of concerts. And the TSO, of course, is fantastic. And there's a chamber music environment, and there are 2 other orchestras. There's lots of it.
Like, what were your first impressions of Tasmania after living in Sydney for so long?
Well, I had been down here a number of times on holidays and
Yeah.
trips of one kind or another. And I knew it wasn't perfect, but it had a lot of things going for it. It was a very civilized place. It was human scale, which was very important to me at that time when I came here. That I didn't feel overwhelmed by anything. I was able to merge in quite quickly into the feeling of being here. Could rent a place very quickly, bought a house within a year of being here, and having the city so close to the countryside and to the bush and the beaches and the rest of it.
So were you doing the same? You were doing much the same work when you arrived here?
Yeah, basically, I talked to. I did work with a number of graphic designers as a copywriter. I did work for the TSO. I did work for government bodies and eventually stopped doing that and just focused on doing occasional. As I came into retirement age, kind of doing occasional one-on-one coaching, which I found. Well, I had done it in Sydney a little bit, and I just did more of it down here. It seemed like there was a need for that kind of thing in some larger organizations, either in government or in private industry. People were aware that they could do better, and so they needed some help. So either I'd help them with a document or help them in general to change their approach so that they felt more comfortable doing it.
So the one-on-one coaching was also about helping them improve their writing skills.
Very specifically,
Yes.
Very specifically. And occasionally, I remember once one guy called me who had worked with him in a government body, and he joined another government body based in Canberra, and he called me up one day and said, look, I've got somebody in New Zealand in our associate firm. Could you help them write better? So on the phone. And I said, no, I won't do it on the phone, but I could do it on Skype. So I did. I worked with a few of their people doing exactly what I did here on Skype. And I found it was quite amazing how it could work. Modern technology could bridge the gap. I couldn't do it on the phone because there was no eye contact.
Yeah.
But I could do it on Skype. And that was interesting change for me to move from one-on-one, sitting down like we were sitting here, and do so. They would send me their copy, their documents, and we would talk about it and work from there.
Classical music's obviously been a bit of a theme in our conversation so far.
Yes.
So where did your interest in it begin?
My father was a pianist. He'd put himself through his studies to become a solicitor by having a dance band for things like hunt balls and formal balls and stuff like that in Limerick, or parties. So he played the piano regularly at home, so I was used to having people come into the house. He might play for a concert that was going on in a theatre in town, charity concert or some other concert, and he would accompany singers. One guy I remember was a fellow called Noel Harris. Noel was Richard Harris's brother, the actor, and I caught up with him shortly after I went to Sydney. When he came to do Camelot. I went and saw him after the show, and we had in fact he drove me home in his his chauffeur drove me home in his chauffeured Rolls Royce, because I lived around the corner from the hotel he was staying in. Right. But it's nice to have somebody, I didn't know him, but I knew his brothers, and my father used to play the piano for one of the brothers who was a good tenor. So there was always music around, and I learned how to play the piano a little bit when I was a young fella. It just stuck. When I was going places, I'd go to concerts in London when I was there. That's where it went. I'm a slow learner, as you can tell from my accent. I haven't picked up much of an Australian accent in 40 years here. So I realize some things don't change. When I go back to Ireland, they say, you've got an Australian accent. And I think, what are you hearing? Which isn't there. But I might use 2 or 3 words differently. But yes, unless you really work at it, you don't lose your core. And your core is created in your first 20 or 30 years.
Yeah.
And, perhaps I've become more adult through the rest of that period. But it's built on that foundation. So when I go back to Ireland, I feel very comfortable indeed.
Yeah.
But then when I come back to Hobart, I feel very comfortable indeed.
And when you go back to Ireland, is there anything that you sort of maybe look forward to, or that you experience there that you can't experience here?
No. Basically, except perhaps just the being surrounded by people who sound Irish.
Yeah.
That is a difference. And I suppose that does kind of touch centers in my body that go back to my childhood. And from that point of view, it's not that I don't have a similar feeling here, but they're for Australians or for foreigners, because I live in a multicultural environment and I'm comfortable with that. In all my travels, I still like going to somewhere new or somewhere different, and I enjoy being in a different environment with different coloured people around.
Yeah.
So when I go back to Ireland, there's still a mixture of the old Irish and the new people coming in, and sometimes it's very amusing for me to see to see a black guy and have a word with him, and he talks with a Dublin accent.
And you mentioned about liking to hear the familiar accents again.
Yes.
Is it just about the accents and the accents sort of triggering a memory, or is it about sort of the atmosphere that creates?
It's just the atmosphere it creates. It's not. It doesn't necessarily. No, I don't find it triggers memories, but it may do at a core level, at a gut level. I'm responding to it without being aware that that's what I'm responding to, or that's what it reminds me of. But I'm not conscious of the reminder, but I feel it.